I stared at the roast beef growing cold on my plate as my father's words echoed through our family dining room. Leave your keys and get out, Connor. This house belongs to the family now. My mother Martha nodded silently, her eyes avoiding mine completely. 27 years of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and bedtime stories vanished in that moment. I slowly reached into my pocket, placed my house keys next to the gravy boat, and walked toward the front door without saying a single word. The walk back to my cramped studio apartment felt like stepping through quicksand. Every footstep reminded me of the decision I'd made 3 years earlier that had brought us to this moment. I sat on my secondhand couch staring at the bare walls and let my mind drift back to when everything started falling apart for my family. It was spring of 2021 when Dad's construction company went under. The pandemic had destroyed his client base, and supply chain issues finished off what little business remained. I remember sitting in the same apartment watching him break down over the phone as he explained they were 3 months behind on the mortgage for our family home on Maple Street, the house where I'd grown up, where my sister Bailey had learned to ride her bike, in the driveway, where Mom had hosted countless neighborhood barbecues. "We're going to lose everything, son," he'd said, his voice cracking in ways I'd never heard before. 42 years I've been building this business and it's all gone. The foreclosure notice had arrived 2 weeks later. $678,000. That's what they owed on a house that had been in our family for 15 years. As a software developer for TechFlow Solutions, I was pulling in decent money, but that kind of cash seemed impossible. Still, I couldn't bear the thought of my parents losing their home. I'd spent weeks meeting with loan officers, gathering documents, and filling out applications. My credit score was solid, and I had enough for a down payment if I emptied my entire savings account. The mortgage broker, a friendly woman named Susan Harper, had walked me through every detail. "You understand you'll be the sole owner of the property," she'd explained during our final meeting. "Your parents can live there, but legally this will be your house." Dad had insisted on a different arrangement. "We need to stay on the deed as co-owners," he'd argued. "For tax purposes and because this house represents our life's work. We built equity here for 15 years before things went bad. I should have listened to my girlfriend Rachel when she voiced her concerns." "Connor, this feels wrong," she'd said as we sat in her car outside the title company. "Why do they need to be on the deed if you're paying for everything?" But I trusted my parents completely. These were the people who'd taught me right from wrong, who'd supported me through college, who'd celebrated every accomplishment in my life. The idea that they might have ulterior motives never crossed my mind. The arrangement seemed perfect for everyone. I took out the mortgage and made all payments while Mom and Dad maintained their dignity by staying on as co-owners. They handled maintenance and improvements, treating the house like the family home it had always been. I kept my apartment but stayed over on weekends and holidays. For 3 years, everything worked smoothly. I never missed a payment, and my parents seemed genuinely grateful. They'd host Sunday dinners, where Dad would thank me repeatedly for saving the family home. Mom would pack leftovers for me to take back to my apartment. Bailey would visit during college breaks, and we'd all gather in the living room to watch movies like we had when we were kids. But something had started changing over the past 6 months. Small things at first. Dad asking detailed questions about my mortgage payments. Mom requesting copies of insurance paperwork. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Phone calls that seemed secretive and hurried. I'd attributed it to financial stress. Even though I was covering the house payments, Mom and Dad still struggled with credit card debt and daily expenses. I figured they were working with financial advisors to get back on their feet. The neighbor's comment from last month should have been a bigger warning sign. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door had approached me while I was mowing the lawn. "It's so nice that your parents are letting you stay here sometimes," she'd said with a confused smile. "They mentioned you're their tenant now. Such a modern arrangement." I'd laughed it off, assuming Mom and Dad were just trying to save face in the neighborhood. Pride could make people say strange things about family situations. Now, sitting in my apartment with no house keys in my pocket, That conversation took on an entirely different meaning. My parents had been telling people I was their tenant. They'd been rewriting the story of who owned what, and I'd been completely oblivious. The evening news played softly in the background as I tried to process what had happened. 3 years of mortgage payments, 3 years of property taxes, 3 years of insurance premiums, all paid from my bank account while my parents lived in comfort and security. And now they were telling me the house belonged to the family, not to the person who'd actually purchased it, not to the son who'd sacrificed his savings and taken on massive debt to keep them from losing everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Bailey. Dad told me what happened. I'm so sorry. Can we talk tomorrow? At least my sister still seemed to be on my side. But as I stared at that message, a new kind of dread settled in my stomach. What exactly had Dad told her? And why did Bailey sound like she was apologizing for something she'd had no part in? I poured myself a glass of water and tried to plan my next move. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe emotions had gotten heated and things could be worked out with a calm conversation. My parents were good people who'd raised me to value honesty and family loyalty, but the look in Dad's eyes during dinner hadn't shown any hint of remorse or uncertainty. He'd spoken with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment for a long time, and Mom's silence felt deliberate rather than uncomfortable. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to wonder if the people who taught me to trust completely had been teaching me to be naive. The drive to Bailey's college took me through 3 counties of rolling farmland and small towns. Each mile gave me more time to replay Sunday's dinner, searching for clues I might have missed. By the time I reached Davidson University, my stomach felt like it had been tied in knots with steel cable. Bailey was waiting for me outside her dormitory, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since high school. At 22, she usually carried herself with confidence that reminded me of Mom at that age. But today her shoulders were hunched forward, like she was trying to disappear into her jacket. We found a quiet corner in the Student Union Cafe, away from the clusters of students cramming for midterms. Bailey ordered a coffee she didn't touch, and I watched her fidget with the sleeve around the cup. You need to know what's been happening. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom and Dad have been talking to me about this for months. The first twist of the knife. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in anger. This had been planned, discussed, and coordinated while I'd been making mortgage payments and believing everything was fine. What did they tell you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Bailey's eyes filled with tears. They said you were trying to steal the house. That you'd been manipulating them ever since you bought it, and that you were planning to kick them out and sell it for profit. The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of sacrifice, and my parents had been painting me as the villain in family conversations I'd known nothing about. They showed me emails they said you'd sent, Bailey continued. Messages about how you wanted them to sign over their inheritance rights and how you were tired of supporting them. Bailey, I never sent any emails like that. I would never. I know, she interrupted, tears now flowing freely. I've been struggling with this for weeks because it didn't sound like you at all. But they were so convincing and they had documentation. She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. Mom's contact name appeared above a chain of messages that made my blood run cold. Connor threatened to evict us today unless we sign papers giving up our rights to the house. Your father and I don't know what to do. We trusted him, and now he's using our financial problems against us. Another message from 3 weeks ago. Connor said if we don't agree to his terms, he'll stop making mortgage payments and let the bank take the house. He knows we can't afford it on our own. And a third from just 5 days earlier. We're meeting with a lawyer tomorrow. Connor has been intercepting our mail and hiding documents from us. We think he forged our signatures on some papers. I stared at the phone screen, reading lies about myself, written in my mother's words. The level of calculation required to create this false narrative was staggering. Bailey, none of this is true. I've never threatened them with anything. I've been paying for everything without asking for a single dollar in return. I believe you, she said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. That's why I wanted to see you in person. The brother I know would never do these things. But even as she spoke, I could see the confusion and doubt that months of manipulation had created. My parents had been working systematically to turn my own sister against me, using her love for family and her natural protective instincts. There's more, Bailey said reluctantly. They've been asking me questions about your finances. How much money you make, whether you've mentioned buying other properties, if you've talked about moving somewhere else. The scope of the investigation into my personal life was becoming clear. While I'd been treating them like trusted family members, they'd been treating me like a target. They also asked me to remember conversations we've had about the house. Whether you'd ever said anything about wanting to own it completely or getting them to move out. I realized that every casual comment, every family discussion, every moment of normal conversation had been analyzed for ammunition. My parents had been building a case against me using my own words taken out of context and twisted into evidence of malicious intent. Bailey reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder. They gave me this last month and asked me to keep it safe. They said it contained evidence of what you've been doing. Inside the folder were photocopies of mortgage documents, bank statements, insurance papers, and property tax records, everything related to the house purchase and maintenance. But there were also printed emails that I'd never seen before bearing my name, but containing words I'd never written. One email supposedly from me to Dad read, "I think it's time we discussed your long-term living situation. This arrangement can't continue indefinitely, and I need to start thinking about my own financial future." Another addressed to both parents. "I've been covering your expenses for 3 years now. I think it's reasonable to expect some documentation about what happens to your portion of the house value when you're no longer able to live there." The emails were crafted with care. They weren't obviously threatening or abusive. Instead, they painted a picture of someone gradually becoming more demanding and financially focused. Someone who might start as a generous son, but slowly reveal selfish motives. "Bailey, I never wrote these. I've never even thought these things, much less put them in emails." She nodded. "I know. I've been looking at them for weeks trying to figure out when you changed so dramatically, but then I realized I'd never seen you change at all. Only these emails suggested you had." The final piece of the folder contained legal documents that made my heart stop. A complaint filed with Adult Protective Services alleging financial abuse of elderly parents. A consultation request with an attorney specializing in elder fraud. And a property assessment showing the house's current market value at $850,000. The profit motive was becoming clear. The house had appreciated significantly since I'd purchased it. My parents weren't just trying to keep their home. They were positioning themselves to cash out on equity I'd created through 3 years of payments and improvements. "There's something else," Bailey said, her voice dropping even lower. "Frank Morrison." "Who's Frank Morrison?" "The lawyer they hired? He specializes in cases where adult children allegedly abuse their parents financially. Mom and Dad have been meeting with him for 6 weeks. The timeline was devastating. While I'd been planning Christmas gifts and thinking about family vacation possibilities, my parents had been meeting with attorneys and building legal strategies. Morrison told them they have a strong case because their names are on the deed and they can prove they lived in the house before you bought it. He said judges are very sympathetic to elderly parents who've been taken advantage of by their children." I sat back in my chair feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. This wasn't just family drama that would blow over with time and conversation. This was a calculated legal assault designed to strip me of everything I'd invested in that house. "Bailey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." She nodded. "Are you going to testify against me if this goes to court?" For the first time since we'd started talking, she looked directly into my eyes. 6 months ago, I would have. They were very convincing and I loved them. But seeing you now, hearing your side and thinking about all the inconsistencies I've been ignoring, I believe you're telling the truth. It was the first piece of good news I'd heard, but it came with a crushing realization. My parents had been willing to destroy my relationship with my sister as part of their plan. They'd been prepared to turn the entire family against me to get what they wanted. As we walked back to Bailey's dorm, she mentioned one final detail that sent chills through me. "They've been recording phone calls with you for the past 2 months. Dad has some kind of app on his phone that saves everything automatically." Every conversation I'd thought was private and familial had been documented as potential evidence. My parents had turned themselves into investigators, and I'd been an unwitting suspect providing them with material for my own prosecution. The drive back to my apartment took place in complete silence. I couldn't find words for what I was feeling. Betrayal seemed too small a concept for the systematic deception that had been happening around me. But beneath the pain and shock, something else was starting to grow. Anger. Not the hot, impulsive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, determined variety that focuses the mind and sharpens resolve. If my parents wanted a legal battle, they were about to discover that the son they'd raised to be honest and fair could also be formidable when protecting himself from attack. The certified letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a postal worker who seemed genuinely sympathetic as she handed me the thick envelope. The return address showed Morrison Bradley and Associates Attorneys at Law, in raised lettering that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. Inside legal language spelled out my new reality in terms that were both precise and devastating. I was being formally notified that my parents, described as Harold and Martha Daniels, were asserting their rightful ownership of the property at 1427 Maple Street. According to the complaint, I had manipulated vulnerable elderly individuals into signing documents under false pretenses and was now unlawfully occupying property belonging to the complainants. The letter demanded that I vacate the premises within 30 days and cease all claims of ownership. It also informed me that failure to comply would result in immediate legal action for unlawful detainer fraud and elder abuse. Reading those accusations written in formal legal language felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. The people who had raised me, who had taught me the difference between right and wrong, were now accusing me of the kind of behavior they'd always said was despicable. I immediately called Sandra Liu, an attorney who'd been recommended by a coworker. Her practice focused on real estate disputes, and she agreed to see me that same afternoon. Sandra's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, but she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd handled complicated family situations before. "Tell me about the original transaction," she said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. I walked her through everything. The foreclosure threat, my decision to help the mortgage application process, the insistence on keeping my parents as co-owners. She took notes without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or dollar amounts. "Do you have documentation of your payments?" she asked. I'd brought bank statements showing 3 years of mortgage transfers, property tax payments, insurance premiums, and maintenance expenses. Every dollar had come from my accounts, and the paper trail was clear and consistent. Sandra reviewed the documents carefully, then looked up with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal sympathy. "Connor, you've been making every payment on this property for 36 months. You have clear documentation of ownership and financial responsibility. But there are some complications that we need to address." The first complication was the co-ownership structure. Because my parents' names appeared on the deed alongside mine, they had legal standing to claim ownership rights. A judge would need to determine whether their presence on the deed reflected genuine ownership or was simply a courtesy arrangement. The second complication was more serious. Your parents have filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services alleging financial abuse. That triggers an automatic investigation that could result in criminal charges if the investigators believe their claims. I felt the walls of the office closing in around me. What kind of criminal charges? Elder abuse, fraud, theft by deception. If convicted, you could face significant fines and imprisonment. More immediately, there will likely be a temporary restraining order preventing you from accessing the property or contacting your parents during the investigation. The legal system I'd always trusted to protect innocent people was being weaponized against me by my own family. Every protection designed to help vulnerable elderly people was being used to attack someone who'd actually helped them. There's something else, Sandra continued. I've dealt with Frank Morrison before. He's very good at what he does, and he specializes specifically in cases like this. He knows how to present elderly clients as sympathetic victims and adult children as manipulative predators. That afternoon, while I was still processing the legal implications, two more devastating pieces of news arrived. First, I received a call from my bank informing me that my accounts had been frozen pending the outcome of the Adult Protective Services investigation. Until the allegations were resolved, I couldn't access my savings checking or credit accounts. The financial paralysis was immediate and terrifying. I couldn't pay rent, buy groceries, or even put gas in my car. The system designed to prevent financial abuse was now perpetrating financial abuse against me. The second blow came in the form of a phone call that I initially ignored. Rachel's number appeared on my screen twice before I finally answered. "Connor, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, distant, final. We met at a coffee shop near her apartment, the same place where we'd had our first date 2 years earlier. But nothing about this conversation resembled the warm, easy connection we'd built together. "I can't do this anymore," she said without preamble. "The family drama, the legal problems, the stress. It's affecting my work, my sleep, everything." I tried to explain what was really happening to help her understand that I was the victim in this situation, not the perpetrator. But Rachel had already made up her mind. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said. "Your parents seem like good people, and now there are official investigations and lawyers involved. I can't be with someone who might be facing criminal charges." The breakup felt like losing another piece of my identity. Rachel had been my partner, my confidant, the person I'd imagined building a future with. Now she was looking at me like I might be a stranger capable of terrible things. That evening, I packed a duffel bag and drove to my college roommate Danny's house across town. He and his wife Lisa welcomed me without questions, offering their guest room for as long as I needed it. "This is insane," Danny said, as we sat in his garage drinking beer and trying to make sense of the situation. "Your parents always seemed so normal when we were in college." But even Danny's support came with underlying uncertainty. I could see the questions in his eyes, the natural doubt that comes when someone you trust is accused of serious wrongdoing by their own family. Over the following week, the investigation expanded in ways that revealed just how thoroughly my parents had prepared their case. Adult Protective Services interviewed neighbors, reviewed financial records, and examined every aspect of the house purchase and subsequent arrangement. The investigator, a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, approached the case with the assumption that elderly people don't lie about their own children without good reason. My documentation of payments and legal ownership seemed less important than my parents' emotional testimony about feeling manipulated and threatened. "Your parents are very upset," Hendricks explained during our interview. "They feel like you've been taking advantage of their trust and their financial vulnerability." I tried to present evidence of my innocence, but the system wasn't designed to give equal weight to documentation and emotional testimony. My parents' tears carried more legal weight than my bank statements. The most devastating revelation came when Sandra Liu called with news from her own investigation into the case. "Connor, there's something else happening here that's bigger than a family dispute," she said. "Your parents didn't just decide to do this on their own. They've been working with people who have experience in this kind of fraud." The word fraud hit me like a physical blow. Not fraud committed by me, but fraud committed against me. My own parents had been coached in how to steal my property using the legal system itself as their weapon. I've been researching Frank Morrison's other cases, Sandra continued. He's handled 12 similar situations in the past 5 years. Adult children who buy property to help their parents then get accused of elder abuse and lose everything. The pattern was becoming clear. Morrison had developed a specialty in helping elderly people steal property from their own children by exploiting the legal system's bias toward protecting seniors. My parents weren't just betraying me, they were following a proven playbook. How many of those 12 cases resulted in the parents keeping the property? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. All of them. I hung up the phone and sat in Danny's guest room, staring at the wall and trying to process the magnitude of what I was facing. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was systematic theft disguised as legal protection. But somewhere in the darkness of that realization, a new kind of determination was beginning to form. If my parents wanted to play hardball with professional guidance, they were about to discover that their son had learned a thing or two about persistence and strategic thinking. The fight for my house was just beginning, and I was no longer going to approach it like a family dispute. From now on, this was war. The call came at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, jolting me awake in Danny's guest room. Sandra's voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench before she'd said a single word about why she was calling so early. "Connor, we have a major problem. You need to get to my office immediately." I threw on clothes and drove across town through early morning traffic, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Sandra was waiting in her office with a stack of documents spread across her conference table and an expression that mixed anger with disbelief. "Your parents didn't just take legal action against you," she began. "They've been actively committing crimes using your identity." The documents she showed me revealed a level of betrayal that went beyond anything I'd imagined possible. 6 months earlier, while I'd been making regular mortgage payments and believing everything was normal, my parents had applied for a home equity line of credit against the house. The application bore my forged signature and included copies of my pay stubs, tax returns, and bank statements. Someone had gone through my personal documents with meticulous care, creating a complete financial profile that supported a loan application for $200,000. How did they get access to all of this? I asked, staring at copies of documents I kept in a filing cabinet in my apartment. "That's what we need to figure out," Sandra replied. "But first you need to understand what they did with the money." Bank records showed that the home equity loan had been approved and funded 3 months ago. The funds had been transferred to a joint account belonging to my parents, and from there the money had disappeared into a series of transactions that revealed their true priorities. $45,000 had been spent on a luxury cruise to the Mediterranean. $32,000 had gone toward a brand new Cadillac SUV. Another $28,000 had purchased furniture and home improvements. The remaining money had been distributed among various purchases that looked more like a shopping spree than emergency expenses. "They've been living like lottery winners while you've been paying the mortgage on the property they used as collateral," Sandra said. "And now you're responsible for payments on a loan you didn't know existed." The mortgage company had been sending statements to the house on Maple Street, where my parents had been intercepting and hiding them. 3 months of missed payments had already been reported to credit agencies, devastating the credit score I'd spent years building. "It gets worse," Sandra continued. "The mortgage company is initiating foreclosure proceedings on your original loan because they consider the undisclosed home equity loan a violation of your mortgage terms." I was facing a perfect storm of financial destruction. My parents had stolen $200,000, using my identity destroyed my credit rating, and triggered foreclosure on a property I'd been faithfully paying for, all while positioning themselves as victims of my alleged abuse. "How is this even possible?" I asked. "Don't lenders verify identity for large loans?" Sandra pulled out the loan application, and pointed to a series of details that revealed the sophistication of the fraud. The application had been submitted with my social security number, employment information, and financial data. But it had also included a letter supposedly from me authorizing my parents to act on my behalf due to my busy work schedule and travel commitments. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, written in language that sounded plausible while creating legal cover for my parents to handle the entire transaction. It had been notarized by someone named Jennifer Walsh, a notary public, whose office was located in the same building as Frank Morrison's law firm. "Your parents didn't figure this out on their own," Sandra said. "This level of planning and legal sophistication suggests they had professional guidance from the beginning." The realization that my parents had been coached in how to destroy my life was somehow more painful than the financial damage itself. This hadn't been a moment of desperation or poor judgment. It had been a calculated campaign executed with expert assistance. That afternoon brought another devastating revelation. My employer, TechFlow Solutions, called to inform me that they'd received inquiries from investigators about my financial situation and potential criminal activity. My supervisor, Tom Bradley, asked me to come in for a meeting that would determine whether I could continue working while under investigation. "Connor, you've been a solid employee for 4 years," Tom said as we sat in his office. "But we can't have someone facing elder abuse charges representing our company to clients." I tried to explain what was really happening, but Tom had already received calls from Adult Protective Services describing me as someone who'd manipulated vulnerable elderly people for financial gain. The company's legal department had advised placing me on unpaid administrative leave pending resolution of the charges. Losing my income while facing massive financial obligations felt like being trapped in quicksand. Every struggle to escape only pulled me deeper into an impossible situation. That evening, as I sat in Danny's garage trying to process the full scope of the disaster, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to an elderly woman who spoke with the kind of careful precision that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations. "Is this Connor Daniels?" "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Mrs. Patterson. I live across the street from your parents. I think we need to talk." Mrs. Patterson had been watching the situation unfold from her front porch with growing concern and suspicion. As a retired legal secretary who'd worked for 30 years in real estate law, she recognized the signs of something more complex than a simple family dispute. "Your parents have been very busy the past few months," she said, as we met at a diner across town. "Lots of visitors, lots of paperwork, lots of hushed conversations in the driveway." She'd observed Frank Morrison visiting the house multiple times, often carrying briefcases and staying for hours. She'd also noticed a real estate agent conducting what appeared to be property assessments, taking photographs and measurements while my parents watched from the porch. "But what really got my attention was the conversation I overheard last week," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Your father was on the phone in his backyard talking about closing dates and profit margins." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fit together. My parents weren't just trying to steal the house I'd bought. They were planning to sell it and keep the profits, having successfully transferred ownership through legal manipulation and fraudulent loans. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson said. "They've had the same buyer lined up for 2 months, a young couple who've been driving by regularly, measuring the yard and talking about renovation plans. The sale price had already been negotiated, $850,000. After paying off both mortgages, my parents would walk away with over $400,000 in cash, while I would be left with destroyed credit criminal charges and no recourse for recovery." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled sadly. "Because I've seen what good parents look like, and I've seen what con artists look like. Your parents are acting like con artists, and you're acting like someone who's been devastated by people he trusted." As I drove back to Danny's house that night, the full magnitude of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about my parents wanting to keep their house. It was about them stealing a significant amount of money using a sophisticated fraud scheme designed to exploit both my trust and the legal system's bias toward protecting elderly people. But Mrs. Patterson's willingness to share what she'd observed gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in weeks. If my parents had been operating openly enough for neighbors to notice, they'd left a trail of evidence that could expose the truth about what they'd really been doing. The question was whether I could gather enough proof to overcome a legal system that was already inclined to believe their version of events over mine. The private investigator's office smelled like stale coffee and old paperwork. But Jake Sullivan himself exuded the kind of quiet competence that made me feel like I'd finally found someone who understood the gravity of my situation. A former police detective with 22 years of experience, Jake specialized in financial fraud cases and came highly recommended by Sandra Liu. "Your parents have been sloppy," he said after reviewing everything I'd brought him. "People who plan elaborate frauds usually get overconfident and start making mistakes." Jake's initial investigation focused on the timeline of events surrounding the home equity loan. Within 48 hours, he'd uncovered details that revealed just how long my parents had been planning their scheme. The forged signature on the loan application wasn't a spontaneous creation. Handwriting analysis showed evidence of practice attempts suggesting someone had spent considerable time learning to replicate my signature. Jake's contacts at the bank revealed that my parents had visited the loan office multiple times over several weeks, asking detailed questions about documentation requirements and approval processes. They were conducting reconnaissance, Jake explained, learning exactly what they needed to pull this off successfully. More disturbing was the discovery that my parents had been photographing documents in my apartment during family visits. My father had apparently taken pictures of tax returns, bank statements, and employment records, while I'd been in other rooms creating the comprehensive financial profile they'd used for the fraudulent loan application. "Every time they visited your place, they were gathering intelligence," Jake said. "This wasn't family bonding time. It was a criminal operation." The investigation also revealed the true extent of Frank Morrison's involvement in the scheme. Morrison hadn't just been providing legal advice. He'd been orchestrating a coordinated attack designed to transfer property ownership while making me appear to be the criminal. Jake discovered that the notary who'd witnessed the forged documents, Jennifer Walsh, was Morrison's sister-in-law. The home equity loan had been processed by Kellerman Financial Services, a company owned by Steve Kellerman, who turned out to be my father's former business partner from the construction company. "This isn't just your parents betraying you," Jake explained. "It's a conspiracy involving multiple people who've done this before." The most shocking discovery came when Jake traced the history of Morrison's legal practice. Over the past 7 years, he'd handled dozens of cases involving elderly parents who'd accused their adult children of financial abuse. In every single case, the parents had ended up with full ownership of valuable property that had originally been purchased or improved by their children. "It's a pattern," Jake said, spreading out a timeline of Morrison's cases. Adult child helps parents with property. Parents claim abuse. Morrison files legal action. Property gets transferred to parents. Parents sell property and disappear. Jake had identified at least 15 families who'd lost property worth a combined total of over $6 million through virtually identical schemes. In each case, the adult children had been left financially destroyed while their parents had walked away with significant cash settlements. "Your parents aren't just betraying you," Jake concluded. "They're part of a professional operation that systematically destroys families for profit." Armed with this evidence, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I was going to file criminal complaints against everyone involved in the conspiracy, including my own parents. Sandra Liu helped me prepare comprehensive documentation for multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI's white-collar crime unit expressed immediate interest due to the interstate banking fraud and the pattern of similar crimes across state lines. The local police financial crimes division agreed to investigate the identity theft and forgery charges. Adult Protective Services ironically opened their own investigation into my parents after learning that they'd been using the agency's protective services as cover for criminal activity. But the most important breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake's investigation had identified other victims of Morrison's schemes, and several of them agreed to come forward with their stories. The first was a woman named Carol Peterson, whose parents had stolen her lake house through an identical fraud 2 years earlier. Carol had tried to fight the charges alone and had lost everything, but she'd kept meticulous records that corroborated the pattern of criminal behavior. The second victim was a man named David Chen, who'd lost a rental property worth $300,000 when his parents claimed he'd forced them to sign ownership documents under duress. David's case had been dismissed by prosecutors who believed the parents' testimony, but his documentation showed the same forged signatures and fraudulent loan applications I'd encountered. The third victim provided the most damaging evidence. Sarah Williams had actually succeeded in exposing the fraud in her case, but only after her parents had already sold the stolen property and fled the state with the proceeds. Sarah's criminal investigation had uncovered bank records showing payments from Steve Kellerman to Frank Morrison, documenting their financial partnership in the fraud scheme. "We have enough evidence to bring down the entire operation," Sandra explained during our strategy meeting. "But you need to understand that this means your parents will likely face significant prison time." The decision to pursue criminal charges against my own parents was the hardest choice I'd ever faced. Despite everything they'd done, these were still the people who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who'd been present for every important moment of my childhood. But they'd made their choice when they decided to destroy my life for financial gain. And they'd made it even clearer by involving other families in similar schemes, turning elder abuse protections into weapons for systematic theft. That weekend, I visited my grandmother for the first time in over a year. She lived in an assisted living facility across town, and I'd always assumed she was there by choice after selling her house to fund her retirement. The conversation we had changed everything I thought I knew about my family's history. "Oh, honey," she said when I explained what was happening, "your parents did the same thing to me 3 years ago." My grandmother's story was heartbreakingly familiar. My father had convinced her to add his name to her property deed for estate planning purposes. Then he'd claimed she was becoming mentally incompetent and needed him to manage her finances. Within 6 months, her house had been sold, and she'd been placed in assisted living with the proceeds supposedly being used for her care. "I tried to fight it," she explained, "but who's going to believe an 80-year-old woman over her own son, especially when he had legal documents showing I'd agreed to everything?" The pattern of behavior went back years, not months. My parents had been systematically stealing from family members using the same techniques they'd now turned against me. I hadn't just been betrayed, I'd been targeted by people who'd made theft a family tradition. But my grandmother had something my parents didn't know about. She'd kept copies of the original documents that proved she'd never agreed to sell her house or transfer ownership to my father. Hidden in her jewelry box were papers that could expose years of fraudulent activity. "I've been saving these for the right time," she said, handing me a manila envelope. "I think the time might be now." As I drove away from the assisted living facility, I realized that my parents' greatest mistake had been underestimating the determination of the family members they'd victimized. They'd assumed that shame and confusion would keep their victims silent. Instead, they'd created a growing coalition of people who were ready to fight back, with evidence determination and the kind of righteous anger that comes from being betrayed by people who were supposed to protect them. The legal war was about to escalate dramatically, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might actually have the weapons I needed to win. The FBI field office in downtown looked exactly like every federal building I'd ever seen in movies, imposing, sterile, and designed to make visitors feel both protected and intimidated. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez led me through security checkpoints to a conference room where boxes of evidence covered a table that could have seated 12 people. Mr. Daniels, what started as your family dispute has become something much larger, Agent Martinez explained. We're now investigating a multi-state fraud operation that's been active for at least 7 years. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Jake Sullivan's investigation had uncovered connections between Morrison's law firm, Kellerman Financial Services, and similar operations in 4 other states. The pattern was always identical. Elderly people would be coached to claim financial abuse by their adult children, resulting in property transfers that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Your parents weren't just clients, Agent Martinez continued. Based on bank records and phone communications we've obtained through warrants, they were active participants who received training and compensation for their role in the scheme. The evidence she showed me painted a picture of my parents as something far worse than betrayers. They were professional con artists who'd been recruited specifically because of their relationship with me and the property I'd purchased. Bank records revealed payments from Kellerman Financial to my parents dating back 8 months before they'd initiated legal action against me. The payments were disguised as consulting fees, but the amounts and timing clearly linked them to their participation in the fraud. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between my parents and both Morrison and Kellerman during the 6 months leading up to their legal action. The frequency and duration of these communications indicated extensive planning and coordination. Most damaging were transcripts of recorded conversations obtained through court-authorized wiretaps. Agent Martinez played excerpts that made my stomach turn. My father's voice. "The kid trusts us completely. He won't see this coming until it's too late to fight back." My mother's voice. "Morrison says we need to document everything to make the abuse claims believable. I've been taking pictures of his financial papers every time we visit his apartment." Kellerman's voice. "Once we get the equity loan approved, you'll need to start the emotional manipulation. Make him feel guilty for questioning your decisions. That's how we keep him from getting suspicious." Hearing my parents discuss manipulating my emotions as part of a calculated fraud felt like being gutted with a knife. They hadn't just stolen my money. They'd weaponized my love for them as part of their criminal strategy. But the investigation had also uncovered evidence that would ultimately save me. The FBI had been tracking Kellerman's operation for 2 years, and my case had provided them with the final pieces they needed to bring down the entire network. "We have enough evidence for federal charges including conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering," Agent Martinez explained. "Your parents are looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison if convicted." The same day the FBI was explaining the federal case, Bailey called with news that changed everything about our family relationships going forward. "I went to see Grandma yesterday," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "She told me what Mom and Dad did to her 3 years ago." Bailey had independently discovered the pattern of abuse that stretched back through our family history. Learning that our parents had been systematically stealing from family members for years had destroyed any remaining loyalty she felt toward them. "I'm going to testify for the prosecution in both the state and federal cases," she announced. "And I'm bringing Grandma's documents to prove this has been going on for years." With Bailey's support secured, the prosecution's case became overwhelming. But the most dramatic breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jake Sullivan called on a Friday afternoon with news that made me sit down hard in Danny's kitchen chair. "Your parents' house was raided by federal agents this morning," he said. "What they found is going to destroy any remaining credibility Morrison's operation might have had." The search warrant had been executed at dawn, with agents removing dozens of boxes of evidence from my childhood home. Hidden in the basement was a sophisticated document forgery operation, complete with printers, scanners, and software designed to replicate official paperwork. Agents had also discovered financial records showing the full scope of the fraud network. My parents had been involved in 12 other cases over the past 4 years, earning over $200,000 in fees for their participation in schemes that had stolen property worth more than $4 million. They weren't just targeting you, Jake explained. They were targeting anyone who'd helped their parents financially. And they were good at it. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed file containing personal information about dozens of potential victims. My parents had been recruiting other elderly people to participate in similar schemes using their success in stealing from me as proof that the strategy worked. They turned elder abuse protection into a criminal enterprise, Jake said, and they were planning to expand the operation nationally. That same afternoon, local news stations began reporting on the federal raids. The story of parents stealing from their own children as part of a larger fraud ring captured public attention immediately. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from reporters' attorneys representing other victims and people who suspected they might have been targeted by similar schemes. The private family nightmare had become a public scandal that exposed systematic abuse of legal protections designed to help elderly people. But the media attention also brought unexpected allies. Other adult children who'd been victimized by their parents came forward with stories that corroborated the pattern of behavior. Neighbors who'd witnessed suspicious activity around my parents' house provided additional evidence. Even former clients of Morrison's law firm contacted authorities with information about questionable legal advice they'd received. The most important new ally was Rachel. She called on Saturday morning, her voice filled with regret and determination. "Connor, I saw the news reports about the FBI raids. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you when you tried to explain what was happening." Rachel had spent the week researching the criminal charges and talking to mutual friends about our relationship. Learning that I'd been the victim of an elaborate fraud rather than the perpetrator of elder abuse had completely changed her perspective. "I want to help however I can," she said. "I kept copies of conversations you had about your parents, including times when you expressed concern about their financial requests. That might be useful for proving you never had any intention of defrauding them." Having Rachel's support restored felt like getting back a piece of my identity that I'd thought was lost forever. Her willingness to admit she'd been wrong and to actively help with the legal case demonstrated the kind of character I'd fallen in love with originally. By Sunday evening, the prosecution team had compiled evidence that painted a clear picture of a sophisticated criminal operation that had been masquerading as family disputes for years. My parents Morrison and Kellerman were all facing federal charges that would likely result in significant prison sentences. But beyond the legal victory, something more important was happening. The investigation had exposed a systematic abuse of elder protection laws that was affecting families across the country. Congressional representatives were calling for hearings to examine how legal protections for elderly people were being exploited by criminal organizations. My personal tragedy was becoming a catalyst for systemic reform that would protect other families from experiencing similar betrayals. The pain of losing my parents to their own greed was being transformed into something that could prevent others from suffering the same fate. As I sat in Danny's garage that Sunday night reviewing the evidence that would soon send my parents to federal prison, I realized that justice was finally within reach. Not just for me, but for all the families who'd been destroyed by people they'd trusted to love and protect them. The legal battle was almost over, but the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras on the morning of my parents' sentencing hearing. 6 months of investigation and legal proceedings had culminated in guilty pleas from Harold and Martha Daniels, Frank Morrison, Steve Kellerman, and 4 other conspirators involved in what prosecutors called the largest elder abuse fraud scheme in the state's history. I walked up those steps with Bailey on one side and Rachel on the other, feeling something I hadn't experienced in over a year: genuine peace about the future. The nightmare that had begun with a Sunday dinner betrayal was finally ending with complete vindication and justice. Inside the courtroom, my parents sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller and older than I remembered. They'd both aged dramatically during the investigation, as if the weight of their crimes had physically diminished them. When they turned to look at me as I entered, I saw shame in their eyes for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Federal Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the attorney, had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence documenting the scope of the fraud operation. Her sentencing remarks left no doubt about her view of what my parents and their conspirators had done. This court has seen many cases of financial fraud, she began, but rarely have we encountered such systematic exploitation of family relationships and legal protections designed to help vulnerable people. The defendants didn't just commit theft, they perverted the very concept of family loyalty and parental protection. Harold Daniels was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with restitution requirements that would strip him of every asset he'd accumulated through years of fraud. Martha Daniels received 15 years with similar financial penalties that would ensure she could never profit from her crimes. Frank Morrison, as the architect of the scheme, received 25 years. Steve Kellerman got 22 years. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. But the sentences were only part of the justice being served. The federal investigation had led to criminal charges in 8 other states, ultimately exposing fraud networks that had stolen over $30 million from families across the country. More importantly, the case had prompted Congress to pass new legislation requiring additional verification procedures for financial transactions involving elderly people and their adult children. The Family Protection Act, as it became known, created safeguards that would prevent future criminals from exploiting elder abuse protections. For me personally, the legal victory meant complete financial restoration. Insurance policies covered my legal expenses, and restitution orders required my parents to return every dollar they'd stolen plus damages for the credit destruction and emotional trauma they'd caused. The house on Maple Street was returned to my sole ownership, with all fraudulent liens removed. Property values in the neighborhood had continued rising, and the house was now worth over $900,000. The equity my parents had tried to steal had actually increased during their failed attempt to destroy my life. But money and property were just the beginning of what I'd gained through this experience. Bailey and I had developed a relationship stronger than anything we'd shared as children. Working together to expose our parents' crimes and support our grandmother had created a bond built on mutual respect rather than mere family obligation. "I'm proud of how you handled this," she told me as we left the courthouse. "A lot of people would have given up or tried to handle it quietly to avoid embarrassing the family. You chose to fight for what was right, even when it meant our parents would go to prison." Rachel and I had also rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of deeper understanding and communication. Her initial reaction to the legal allegations had been hurtful, but her willingness to admit her mistake and actively support my fight for justice had demonstrated growth that made our relationship stronger than before. "I learned something important about trust," she said as we walked back to the house on Maple Street, now truly our home. "I trusted other people's opinions about your character instead of trusting what I knew about you personally. I won't make that mistake again." Perhaps most meaningfully, I'd found a new purpose that transformed my pain into something constructive. The Connor Daniels Foundation, which I established with part of the restitution money, provided legal assistance and financial support to families affected by elder abuse fraud. Working with other victims had shown me that recovery was possible even from the most devastating betrayals. Families could heal, finances could be restored, and justice could prevail when people were willing to fight for truth instead of accepting convenient lies. My grandmother moved out of assisted living and into a beautiful apartment near downtown, her independence restored, along with her financial security. At 83, she'd found new energy for living that came from seeing justice served and family relationships rebuilt on honest foundations. Your parents forgot something important. she told me during one of our weekly dinners. Family is about love and protection, not ownership and control. You remembered that even when they forgot it. The nonprofit work also led to unexpected career growth. My expertise in financial fraud and family dynamics made me a sought-after consultant for banks, legal firms, and government agencies working to prevent similar crimes. TechFlow Solutions not only welcomed me back, but promoted me to senior analyst with responsibilities for developing security protocols that would prevent the kind of identity theft my parents had perpetrated. My personal experience with fraud had made me uniquely qualified to design protection systems for other potential victims. 6 months after the sentencing, Rachel and I were married in the backyard of the house on Maple Street, surrounded by friends and the chosen family we'd built from people who valued honesty and loyalty. Bailey served as maid of honor, and Danny was my best man in a ceremony that celebrated new beginnings rather than dwelling on past betrayals. As we exchanged vows under the oak tree I'd climbed as a child, I realized that the house had become something different than what my parents had intended. Instead of being a symbol of their manipulation and greed, it had become a foundation for the authentic family relationships I'd always wanted. The most powerful moment of healing came 8 months later when I received a letter from my mother in federal prison. 3 pages of handwriting that began with the words I'd never expected to read, "Dear Connor, I am deeply sorry for what we did to you." The letter didn't excuse or minimize their crimes, but it acknowledged the full scope of the betrayal and expressed genuine remorse for the pain they'd caused. My mother explained that greed and fear had corrupted their judgment, leading them to justify increasingly terrible actions until they'd lost sight of what mattered most. "You were the best son any parents could ask for," she wrote. "You saved our home when we couldn't save it ourselves, and we repaid your generosity with cruelty and theft. We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we want you to know that we recognize how wrong we were." I never responded to that letter, but I kept it as a reminder that even the deepest betrayals could eventually lead to acknowledgement of truth. My parents would spend most of their remaining years in prison, but at least they would spend those years understanding the magnitude of what they'd lost through their own choices. 2 years after that devastating Sunday dinner, I stood in the same dining room, but everything had changed. Rachel and I were hosting our own family gathering with Bailey and her new boyfriend, my grandmother Danny and Lisa, and several friends from the nonprofit foundation. The conversation was warm and genuine, filled with laughter and planning for the future rather than hidden agendas and manipulation. The house that had been the center of so much pain had become a symbol of what family relationships could be when built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. As I looked around the table at people who'd chosen to be part of my life, rather than claiming family privileges they hadn't earned, I realized that losing my parents had actually taught me what real family meant. True family isn't determined by blood relationships or shared history. It's created by people who choose to love, support, and protect each other without expecting anything in return, except the same consideration and loyalty. The betrayal that nearly destroyed my life had ultimately led me to build a better life than I'd ever imagined possible. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us create opportunities for the best things we never knew we needed. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and standing up for what's right? The hardest decisions often teach us the most important lessons about who we really are and what kind of life we want to build. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how you've handled difficult family situations or times when you had to fight for justice against overwhelming odds. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories of overcoming adversity, and share it with anyone who might need to hear about the importance of standing up to abuse, even when it comes from the people who are supposed to love us most. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes in justice, healing, and the power of choosing our own families based on love and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. Remember that no matter how dark things seem, truth and determination can overcome even the most devastating betrayals. Until next time, keep fighting for what's right. Keep building relationships based on honesty and trust. And never forget that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how courageously you respond when life tests your character.